My childhood is peppered with memories of video games, from vaguely discovering the medium with Atari and Pac-Man when I was just a wee lad, to core memories such as my mom sitting down and playing Mario with me for hours on end until her thumbs nearly blistered, to every time I played Duck Hunt standing right next to the TV with the gun on the screen, totally cheating to blast all those damn ducks, to Christmas when the system that would just change it all for me and Sega Genesis was sitting there, gleaming. This would lead to countless hours in Sonic, and then me tricking my mom to buy me Mortal Kombat, only to later find out that it is filled with blood and guts. Then I had to make a deal with my mom to play with blood turned off. Then N64 brought Mario into the third dimension and completely blew our minds. And shortly after that followed every boy's obsession in 007, which was the first time I shot somebody in the digital world. I'm actually realizing that the way I said that almost makes it sound like I shot someone in the physical world. It's not true. Only in the digital world. Then came PlayStation 2, where I discovered things like Metal Gear Solid that slowed down the gaming experience and really was the first exposure to a more slow and methodical gameplay that would mirror my board game experience in the future. Then there was Xbox, that of course was highlighted by Halo. It introduced a significant increase in dopamine per second when shooting things in the digital world. From there, Xbox 360 through all of the PlayStations really just increased fidelity, and the dopamine per second output continued to rise from one generation to the next to what it is now, which is, I guess when I think back playing the original Mario on the couch with my mom, is completely mind-blowing. And now there's a laundry list of recent highlights in my video game career, if you will. Red Dead Redemption 2, Spider-Man, No Man's Sky, Ghost of Tsushima, Borderlands, Destiny, and my favorite of all time, Elden Ring. However, missing from that list is the complete antithesis to the AAA, high fidelity, high story, crazy open world games that exist today. It is a game like a ninja in the middle of the night that has stolen more hours from my life than I care to admit. In fact, I distinctly remember a few Sunday mornings sipping coffee, playing this game, and all of a sudden it being lunchtime and just really wondering what I'm doing with my life. This game, of course, is Slay the Spire, the video game that I actually didn't find and come to appreciate until I found board games. Ironically, Slay the Spire is a video game that's trying to imitate a board game, but is also built like a video game because of all the complex calculations and interactions that exist. Because of the complex interactions between potions, relics, card upgrades, status effects, it really couldn't be made as a board game. It really said, hey, hold my beer, board games. I'm going to show you how to administer dopamine at the most efficient way possible. It borrows a mechanic from board games that is much beloved in deck building. The ironic part is deck building closely mirrors character progression in video games. The core principle is you start with a weak deck, sort of like a weak character, and you build those things up throughout the game, slowly progressing your power and strength, hopefully building in some synergies to ultimately be able to destroy whatever big bad is eventually in front of you. While the idea of character and player progression is not new to board games, the idea of deck building much closer reflects the scope and what you can accomplish in progression with video games. Video games, however, have eclipsed board games in almost every way. In fact, video games are the highest grossing entertainment medium of all time. And in playing Slay the Spire, the board game, after enjoying many hours of the digital game, I've now come to realize that in the vast majority of areas, video games are just better than board games. And that's why in this video I have 5 reasons why a video game is better than a board game, and 2 very important reasons why you might want to consider its cardboard counterpart. We're going to start with some low-hanging fruit here. It's setup. The setup in this game, you have a main board. You get out 12 decks of cards. There's 3 player mats, a player board, and there's a few other steps needed to get this to the table. I would imagine that once you are up and running and you remember the setup by heart, it's probably going to take 5 to 7 minutes, but it takes me about 10 minutes to get it up and running. And this is an easy win for the digital version. It's up and playing in seconds. You are in the first act, smacking enemies around in no time. All right, now we're going to pivot to something much more complicated and, in my mind, very, very interesting. In both games, battles are quick, snappy, layered with tons of really interesting decisions that lead to the order of cards you play being very, very important. The order of which is important because there's different status effects, potions, and relics all modifying your damage, and that's where we get into a major hang-up when trying to convert a digital version to a board game version. These calculations can be pretty intense. I mean, you can have a player that is attacking, that has multiple strength statuses, attacking an enemy who has a vulnerable status, but also has defense. All of those modify the damage output. And on top of that, the way in which they're applied depends on the cards you're playing. So a card might have multiple attacks on it, meaning the strength will be applied multiple times. So you can see there's a fairly complex arithmetic in there that a player needs to do to understand how much damage they're going to do. And on top of that, you see what your enemy is about to do to you in the next turn, so you're trying to weigh the cost benefit of playing defense versus offense and how that math problem on the back end is going to affect your character. And this is where the comparisons start. The board game is at a serious disadvantage out of the gates. The player is left to do the calculation in their heads, and to the designer's credit, they have made that significantly more simple. It's very easy to do, and it's because they scaled the values down significantly. The downstream effect of this is the gap between what is considered low damage and high damage is significantly decreased. And one of the reasons why this game feels so good in digital is you're constantly scaling this damage, and it can scale to really large numbers. So the feeling of only doing 6 damage out of the gates on a card that then you can scale to 18 damage is much different psychologically than scaling something from 1 to 3. On top of that, the relics and potions that augment your character either for the duration of the game or as one-time use abilities are scaled down a little bit and diluted. And to pair with that, the enemies are also scaled down to match the lower damage output. Take the cultist, for example, has 53 health out of the gates in a video game and 9 health in the board game. Your character, the Ironclad, starts with 80 in the video game and only 10 in the board game. The basic strike card that comes with your character in the video game does 6 damage, and in the board game only does 1. The defense card in the video game blocks 5, while the defense card in the board game only blocks 1. While on the surface, the relative scaling looks about right. There's no imbalances there per se, but the significant scaling down actually has a really big effect. In the board game, when you let an hit through, that's 1/10 of your damage. This leads you to prioritizing defense significantly more than the video game and leads you to deprioritizing interesting combos and card interactions that help you to knock the enemy out. The back and forth and interesting decisions in balancing defense and offense is significantly more in the video game just because of being able to scale it up. The dumbing down of the health system to help us to do the calculation, to me, just leads to significantly less interesting decisions and, more importantly, a dilution of the power fantasy that exists in many of these games. And the second reason is sort of nested to the first. It's how you progress your character. And one of the big ways in doing that is building up your deck. Like I had mentioned, you start with weak cards and you add to those more powerful cards. On top of that, you upgrade your existing cards just to become more and more powerful. That is quickly met with an escalation in difficulty as you progress through 3 different acts in this game, but there is this constant feeling of moving forward. Each and every time you defeat an enemy, you're getting a new card, you're getting to spaces on the board that allow you to buy new cards or upgrade cards. It's this constant feeling of progression that just makes this, actually both games, feel so good. However, there is a difference between the video and board game versions around what exactly these cards are doing. I will say, to be transparent, there are many cards that do the exact same thing, but some of my favorite cards, which are the most complex cards that end up creating some of the best combinations or interesting decisions, have had to be altered. One really great example is the Ironclad's Blood for Blood card. Both cards exist by the same exact name in both games, and they all do something a little bit similar. In the video game, it costs 1 less every time you lose HP, and the damage output is absolutely wonderful at 18. This is a top tier card for Ironclad and something I will always buy when it's in front of me. And in order to get around to having to track each and every time you lose HP, the board game simplifies it. It makes it easy for you, which is totally something that needs to happen because nobody wants to track those things. but it simply costs 1 less when you lose HP. There's no progression to its costing less and less. It's just simple. It gets better the first time you lose HP. On the surface, once again, this sounds like it's pretty comparable. It's an adjustment that actually simplifies play. In a lot of cases, those things are good things, right? Like anytime we can get a board game to the table and has simplified, easy to follow actions. We don't like to track these little fiddly things that just make life difficult and have no real impact on the game. However, in the video game, this one card completely changes the way you play the game. You see, the card costs 4. It is a very expensive card. And every single time you lose HP, whether it's 1 or 80, that card becomes cheaper. If you could somehow get that card to 0 and you're doing 18 damage every time that thing comes up, that is absolutely god tier. It's wonderful. So when you go into a combat, you know you own this card. And what are you trying to do? You're trying to lose health 4 different times. Especially early in combat, before enemies have had a chance to scale, you can easily block a lot of your damage in most cases. However, strategically, if you know you own a copy of this card that is completely overpowered, that would allow you to have really big turns, you might want to let a couple damage through at a time to make this thing overpowered. So now in my decision space for these first 4 turns, I'm now doing math and making an extra, more crunchy decision to try and let damage through. To me, it's just a more interesting card like that. It's also more powerful because you can get it down to 0 within that combat. To be fair, the board game version can be upgraded to be 0 cost, but that doesn't change the way you strategize in going into an enemy encounter. I'm not saying it's bad the way it was converted. I would have probably done the same exact thing. I'm just saying in the video game, with a calculation engine and auto tracking to things like how many times you lost HP, the cards can just be more interesting and be more strategy altering. Another top tier card in the video game is Brutality. It's 0 cost and it gives you a really interesting trade-off. I'm trading 1 life for 1 card. If you've ever played a deck builder, you know that card draw is insanely important. It's important because you start with all of these crappy cards in your hand and you want to get through the deck to the good cards like the previously mentioned Blood for Blood, and you do so with cards like this. Unfortunately, in the board game, this can exist. The conversion of 1 card for 1 life, you would never give up 10% of your life to get 1 card draw. And that scaling down of the numbers just make a card like this not doable whatsoever. It stops a top tier, really interesting card from even existing. The next 2 are pretty simple. They're low hanging fruit. Video games can simply offer more content. We've all seen and maybe had those board games that try to accomplish the same exact thing. It comes with giant boxes and space and complexity and digging through and sorting through. Video games make that content instantly available, and the same goes for Slay the Spire. In the video game, there's 138 relics. In the board game, there's 78. Video game, 42 potions versus the board game at 29. And taking the Ironclad, for example, we had already mentioned that there was a missing card. In the video game, there's 75 unique cards, while in the board game, there's only 59. So, like I said, a really easy win for video games here. And the 5th reason is pretty objective. It's price. This is an easy win for video games. I paid $9.99 for an iOS version. I paid $24.99 for a Steam version. And I paid $172.34 for the board game version. Yeah, the board game version that up until now in the previous 4 categories has lost, in my mind at least, pretty handedly. So those are the 5 reasons why video games are better than board games, using Slay the Spire as a case study. However, I like to be balanced on this channel, and I really wanted to think about the ways in which board games are better. And the first reason that I prefer board games can easily go into the video games column, and it's time spent playing them. Slay the Spire digitally is quick. You can just get a game up and going in seconds. You can get through the first act if you're really acquainted with the game in tens of minutes. You can get through the first battle in less than a minute. It's just easy. It's easy dopamine. You can just fly through it. And once you know the characters, especially in the cards, you are just like throwing cards out there at enemies with barely even thinking about it. In fact, a lot of the calculation part I actually had to research for this video because I didn't realize what all of the battle modifiers were actually doing. I just know that they were either boosting or degrading damage. I wasn't sitting there actually doing the calculations to see how much damage I would do. And that brings me to why I like board games better. I fell in love with board games because of the slow and methodical nature. Really sitting down and mapping out a problem, thinking about all of the different possible solutions and how to optimize that. Video games in a lot of instances are all about hand-eye coordination, reaction time, and as I get a little bit older, those things seem to be degrading. But I still got a little bit up here in the old noggin, and I still like to solve those puzzles. And that's why board games have thrived with me. And I found in playing Slay the Spire, the board game, that I was really thinking through turns in a much more methodical way. I was really looking at all of the cards, doing the math on how much damage I could do, looking at the possible progression of the enemy's attacks. Some of them are activated by dice, so you don't really know what you're going to get, but you can look at those possibilities and weigh the different options. And then there's enemies that progress a cube down the track, so you can see a couple turns in the future what exactly they're going to do. And I felt like I approached this game in a totally different way. I mean, getting through 3 acts was a few hours, where getting through 3 acts, which is at least double the time in the video game, if not more. But I almost felt more deeply satisfied with a little bit less surface level moment-to-moment satisfaction like I had described before. I just like that about board games. I like the idea of sitting down for an afternoon and really diving into something at a really in-depth level instead of the surface level that I approach Slay the Spire, the video game. Now, I will say, I don't know that everyone does that, and some people may really methodically go through the digital version of Slay the Spire in the same way, because all of the information is there. It's not like there's a defect there. It's just the medium, for me, is approached totally differently because in general, board games are more slow and methodical. And that's why in this instance, I prefer the experience of Slay the Spire, the board game. And the second and very last reason that I think board games are actually better than video games is the connection it creates. Even though they're big and bulky, they take time to table, time to take down, they're longer to play, more expensive, they produce less dopamine per second than their digital counterparts. I think there's something to say for sitting across from a table from somebody and looking at them in the eyes, or at least being in proximity during play, creating experiences together. This sounds very hallmarky, but I'll give you an example from my life. I had mentioned my mom and that being a core memory. See, when she sat down on that couch that day with me, I can't even remember how young, but it was very young. It wasn't typical. That wasn't something that I remember throughout my childhood. In fact, I remember that one time. And in the scheme of things, there's so many more important moments that my mother and I shared, but that one in particular just stands out to me, where we sat next to each other on the couch and played this incredibly exciting thing. That experience does not exist today. You know, video games, sure, you can play those old video games, but the stuff my kids like to play, and I like to play, frankly, are online games that you're really in another room from somebody. You don't get that shared experience to the level in which I got with my mom that day. And ever since her passing a few years ago from cancer, that memory has become more and more important. And a game like Slay the Spire allows me to meet my kids on their terms and play something that relates to their experience a little bit more. So hopefully I can create those core memories with them that on that one day my mom created with me. Even outside of kind of that really dramatic example, there was something so interesting to me when I started playing board games with my wife and how our relationship started to change. It did get a little more competitive, and there were certainly times in which it didn't help the relationship, but it's a medium that we can kind of come together and experience that is unlike anything else in our life. There's really something interesting that happens when you are engaged in play with somebody else, especially physically right next to each other, having that shared experience, being able to reference that later in the night on how she kicked my ass in brass. There's just something really unique about that experience. And that's why I play board games. That's why much of my time has shifted away from video games. Although I certainly have my relapses where I will completely obsess over a game, I try to bring the games out into the open with the family and get them involved. I at least use them as a tool to bring people together. And that's something that, while there are online communities, it's just different. And that's why, even with all of the wins that Slay the Spire Digital has racked up in this video, I don't regret my purchase of this $172 giant box that is derivative of a game I already have that is significantly cheaper and better in most ways. I don't regret it because this will help me get my son in particular around the table to play a game together. It will pull him away from Fortnite a little bit and give us yet another shared experience together that I hope one day will be a core memory for him. And if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. If I've delivered any value for you, maybe think about subscribing. Outside of that, have yourself a great week.